We are in a housing crisis, and so I'd be grateful if you could explain to the committee why you took the decision to freeze the local housing allowance rate this year.
Well, we are in housing crisis, you're absolutely right. The way out of that crisis is actually to ensure that we've got a sufficient number of homes, roofs over people's heads in all the areas that are needed, which is one of the major drivers of the housing crisis that we're in, and that's why we've been clear in our ambition to build homes, 1.5 million homes over the period of this Parliament, and within that to make sure that there's a significant number of affordable homes. So that's, I completely accept the definition of a housing crisis. We need to make sure that we have the wherewithal to get out of that crisis.
Just on that, you've talked about homes. In less than a week, most of us in this room will be able to spend Christmas with our loved ones in a warm, safe home. But yet 160,000 children are going to wake up on Christmas Day in temporary accommodation. And there was a feature on the BBC News last night, in News at 10, which showed the reality of people paying thousands of pounds for temporary accommodation, which was frankly overflown with sewage. This is the reality people are facing, Prime Minister. And most of them are only in this situation because they lost the safety net of the LHA freeze. And the ONS data yesterday showed that average rent rises is going up by 9.3% in the private rented sector. Prime Minister, do you really understand the impact of freezing and making this decision?
Yes, and can I just take out, the numbers you quote to me on homelessness or temporary accommodation are appalling. That is what we've inherited, and you will have seen that just in the last week or two, the Deputy Prime Minister's set out the further money we're putting into dealing with homelessness and temporary accommodation, and the money that she's putting into local councils, and the initiatives that we are supporting. The Mayor of Manchester, for example, has been bearing down on homelessness, as you know, and we want to build on that around the country, and that's why we put that money aside. But yeah, it's a terrible inheritance.
But
it's record numbers.
Yeah,
and
but
it's
Prime Minister,
shocking.
do you understand that the additional funding to address homelessness is effectively redundant if you're not dealing with the root cause of why people have been forced into temporary accommodation, including freezing the LHA allowance?
Well, we've got to put the money in to support them in the homelessness and the temporary accommodation, and that is what we're doing. And these figures have been very high for a long time. We've inherited them, and we need to turn them around.
We are very grateful and we welcome the government's ambition in terms of new homes, but these figures that you've quoted, that 1.5 million, they have to be deliverable. You may be aware, Prime Minister, that new dwellings dropped this year, and the number of planning permissions, again, the number of planning permissions granted also fell by 15%. So earlier on you talked about planning reform, you talked about regulation, additional powers for councils. This is only part of the jigsaw in building that. There is a big lag across the supply chain. We don't have the raw materials, we don't have the skilled workforce. So in light of this, and coming back to your ambition and the government's ambition, do you think you're going to hit this 1.5 million target over the course of this Parliament?
Yes, that's why I set it out. I accept it's difficult, I accept it's stretching, but it's hugely important. A home is a base camp for the aspirations and opportunities of all individuals and all families, a safe and secure roof over their head. Amongst the reasons, you're quite right about the numbers this year of houses that haven't been built because the targets were put up and then they were taken down. We've put the targets back up and made them mandatory. We've been really clear that this has to be locally led, so that it's for those within the locality to decide how they're going to comply with the targets, and if they can do so, then all well and good, no need for any intervention from government. If they can't, then we will intervene and push forward. We've been really clear that if it's a brownfield site, then it's a yes by default on planning. That's something that hasn't been there before. And we're also equally clear that we'll make use of the grey belt where it's necessary to do so. That's disused car parks, petrol stations, etc. But we intend to, and the planning reforms, obviously you'll have seen the consultation ended and the framework was issued just a few days ago. These are all the ingredients, in my view, that have been missing and why we haven't been building homes. 1.5 million is ambitious. It hasn't been done for decades. It's desperately needed. And I also know we've got to punch through this because everybody says to me, government needs priorities. Of course it does. As soon as we put priorities up, then everyone says, well, what have you left out? It's unachievable. I don't accept that. I think this is an achievable target, difficult though it is, and we're determined to achieve it.
And again, we commend that, we welcome that, but do you think it's right then that the government haven't set targets in terms of how many homes they'll deliver a year? They haven't set out what tenure those homes will be, but yet you're asking local councils to report back on their targets. Another thing that's coming up, which we've looked at in our committee, is the fact that the skill force and the sector are not able to cope with helping the government build that. Again, coming back to my question, do you really think you can hit that target?
Yes, I do. And just on the targets, the way in which we've done it is to say, here's the mandatory target for each area. We want each area to decide for itself how it's going to meet those targets. What's the mix that they want? Where do they want it? It needs to be locally driven. And so at the first instance, we want that to be the way in which it gets delivered. But what we're not going to tolerate is where that doesn't happen and there isn't a plan put forward to meet the targets, that we're going to leave it as nothing happens. And at that point, the government will intervene. So that's why we're not, as it were, saying in each and every area, you must have this number of houses on that point there, because we don't want to do it in that way. We want it to be local plans. But we're being equally clear that if we don't get the local plans that meet the targets, then yes, there will be levers that we will pull centrally to make sure that that housing is delivered. Yes, of course, that means we've got to work on the supply chains. Yes, of course, it means we've got to have the skills in place. But that's why you need a priority. That's why you need a sense of driving mission to bring this together. And amongst my jobs is to chair the stock takes of the work we're doing, to get the various players around a room like this, to make sure that we've got the skills, the supply chains, the numbers, the targets, with an assessment of where we are on the data. And that's the way we'll drive through this. But I'm not going to be a defeatist on this and say it's impossible to get the supply chains. I don't accept that. I'll be a defeatist and say we're never going to get the skills. I don't accept that. Do I accept it's a stretch? Do I accept it's ambitious? Yes, I do. But we're determined to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to pick up, Prime Minister, because in response to Ms Eshalomi, when she was talking about not lifting the local housing allowance so that people can afford a home of their own, you said, and I may slightly misspeak this quoting you, you said something along the lines of, we are putting money in to support people in temporary accommodation. That leaves an impression that you're supporting people in temporary accommodation over supporting people into permanent homes. I just wondered if that's what you meant to say, or if you'd like to clarify that point.
No, we're doing both.
Okay, so you're going to lift the local housing allowance, the LHA?
I'll give you the details of the money that we laid out a few days ago.
Yeah, we know about the money for temporary accommodation, but it was the local, perhaps Ms Eshalomi,
so
give it one more.
Essentially, the additional funding that councils have received is going to be absorbed because rents are going up higher, and this is forcing families up and down the country into temporary accommodation for much longer. We shouldn't be calling it temporary accommodation, Prime Minister. People are there for 14, 15 years.
Prime Minister.
Yeah, I absolutely understand that. And that is because, or amongst the reasons for that, and the drivers for that, are because the average age for owning your own home now is over 35 years old. And so many people...
So these are people who will never own their own home, that people have to rent because they can't afford to.
Hear me out on the rents have gone through the roof.
Yeah.
Because the competition for rented accommodation is through the roof. It's through the roof because we haven't been building enough houses, and therefore too many people want the same accommodation. It means the landlords are put in a prime position.
Yeah, we know all that. So yes, but what about the local? So you're ruling out completely lifting the LHA because that would help some people get their own homes rather than the temporary accommodation that Ms Eshalomi said.
All of that has been set out in the budget, and we're not unpicking the budget.
Okay, thank you very much. Toby Perkins, MP.
Thank you very much, Chair. Prime Minister, you've been clear that you will back the builders, not the blockers. We know who the builders are, I think. So who are the blockers?
Well, those that say we shouldn't have targets for housing, those that say we should build here, those that have stood in the way for years.
A bit more specific. I mean, who are these people that are doing this?
Well, if you...
Are we talking about planning committees, local councils? Are we talking about local residents groups? Who are these blockers?
Well, all of the above. I was at a housing development in the course of the elections up in York Outer, looking at some housing that had been put up, and it was 20 years from the plan going in before the houses I was looking at were being built, and it was going to be 25 years before that housing estate was completed. That is never going to be enough to get growth in this country. Equally, I was inquiring about onshore wind farms and how long it would take to get one up, and I was told by someone that I thought was totally credible that you could build a wind farm in 2 years. I said, good, because we want clean power by 2030. He then said, well, we won't have that because it'll take 13 years before we get power. I said, well, talk me through that. He said, I'll lose 5 years to planning because somebody will object and I'll be in court for 5 years. I said, well, that needs fixing, but that only gets me to 7 years. I said, what about the other 6 years that takes you to 13? He said, well, the grid that needs to connect me won't begin to crawl towards me until I've got power coming out of my wind power, and then it's going to take 6 years for the grid to get to me. So 13 years for a 2-year project, that's the blockers. And it's no wonder that we're not going to get anywhere unless we get that out of the way. The other example, just that edged on my brain, Scunthorpe Steel. I went up to the steelworks at Scunthorpe. They've got an electric arc furnace they think will be ready by 2029. The grid is going to connect them in 2034. We can't go on like that if we want to grow our... Well, exactly, that's why we want to get rid of the planning regulations.
Mr. Perkins was asking
that's why we want to change the regulations. We want to get our hands on the grid, because if we don't do those, we'll be stuck with these blockers for a very, very long time.
Mr. Perkins.
Okay, so in terms of the infrastructure, I mean, that's your responsibility. In terms of those people like councillors, local communities, that's obviously a key area. Britain's already one of the most nature-depleted nations on earth. Do you think that the current protections for nature in our planning system are excessive?
I think we could get the balance better. I do think we should obviously take measures to protect our environment, to protect nature, of course I do. But I think that we could do it differently. And so one of the proposals, as you know, that we're working on is the question of whether that balance should be struck on each and every application and project, one by one, case by case, or whether it can better be lifted so that you could look at the balance over a wider area, which I think would make a lot more sense.
So the question there would be who pays for that. If it's not the developer, we currently have biodiversity net gain, so on a case-by-case basis they have to replace the nature that they build over. If it's not them, who pays?
I think the developer should pay into a fund that could be used to get that balance right. So I'm not saying they should be exempted from paying in. What I am saying is if you do it on a case-by-case basis, you can get quite a lot of results which slow things down, don't seem on the face of it to make a lot of sense.
So
that doesn't mean that we shouldn't protect nature and the environment.
Okay,
but
well,
I think
on that, the National Planning Policy Framework lists 3 objectives: economic, social and environmental. Is it the case that order is not accidental, that you see that it being the priorities for you, economic, then social, then environmental, or are they 3 sort of equally important issues?
I think they're equally important, but I do think that for far too long we've had projects held up for problems that, whether it's, there are plenty of examples of newts and bats, you name it, or environmental issues, where if we'd looked at it in a slightly more strategic way, I think we could have got through the problem more quickly and more easily. It's not to downgrade the importance of the environment or nature, but I do think we can look at it differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone listening to your speeches will hear a lot more on the growth than they'll hear on the nature protection. You mentioned there, as you've mentioned previously, about bat tunnels. We have the Deputy Prime Minister saying newts are getting in the way of people. What do you think planning officers who are looking at applications, what's the message you want them to hear from this government in terms of nature?
Well, it's important, but we want to build, we want to grow. If there's one inhibitor of our country over the last 14 years, it's been the failure of growth, and we intend to turn that around. And we can't turn it around without changing things. What I've done in years in opposition is ask myself, why have we had low growth in this country for 14 years? And I've walked through, I don't know how many examples with people who know what they're talking about. Having then worked out what's wrong, I intend to put it right. And therefore, yes, we put the emphasis on growth and on the economy. We've been through the worst cost of living crisis since I don't know when. And we were elected in to change that. To change that, we've got to unpick the problems that have caused the low growth in the first place.
And you're committed to a brownfield first policy.
Yeah.
What do you understand to be the reasons why we're not getting brownfield sites outside of London, areas like Chesterfield that I represent? Why do you think we don't get developments on those sites?
Because one, the targets were taken down by the last government, and therefore there was no driving through. Secondly, there's a lot of buying up of land and waiting until it's worth more money and therefore not developed.
Are you doing anything about that?
Well, by pushing through on the proposals that we've got in place, then yes, we do want to do something about that. But equally, by having we are saying to each area, you've got to fulfil these targets, brownfield first, and if you do, get on with it, you'll have our backing and our support, and if you don't, we'll step in and do it for you. So that is already putting some momentum into the system.